Hi, I'm Tony.
And I'm Patrick.
Welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. We are working our way through Nancy Pearcey's book, Finding Truth, 5 Principles for Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes. And we are on principle number 4. So we've worked our way through principle 1, identify the idol. Principle 2, identify the idol's reductionism. Principle 3, then to test the idol against the world to see if it contradicts what we know about the world. And now principle number 4, we're working our way through test the idol against itself to see if it contradicts itself. And so Professor Pearcey has been explaining to us that non-biblical worldviews contradict themselves because of the inherent reductionism that they do. Right. Since they don't worship the true and the living God or have the true and the living God as their ultimate reality, they have to reduce things, right, and put them in a particular box, and therefore things stick out, and those things that are sticking out allow for contradictions, right? And so that's what we've been working our way through here, this chapter 4 on contradictions and self-refutation of worldviews. It's called Why Worldviews Commit Suicide, right? Why they destroy themselves. And so that's what she's been helping us with. We finished up last time talking about this 2 things. First of all, how non-biblical worldviews attempt to exempt themselves from their own critiques, right? Everybody else is wrong, but somehow I can see I have a great perspective on it.
Yeah, you're just so great, Tony. I just want you to know
that's
that.
Right. But everybody else, right?
Right.
And she lists, the usual suspects. Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and Skinner, as folks who do these particular critiques. She says anytime that a truth claim says that truth claims are nothing but X in your, truth finding meter should go on, right? And say, okay, is your truth claim X as well, right? And so that's what she was getting at. And then we ended up with her list here of about 6 or 7 things that she suggests that we have to have, we have to believe in order to function from day to day. We have to assume things like the material world is real. We have to assume that, right? It's nothing that, as the logical positivists wanted us to say, there's no experiment that we can really do, right? Because it could still all be in our head. Right. It can still all be that the universe works by cause and effect, that mathematical truths hold universally, that memories are basically reliable. We have to assume that, right, in order to do science, that other people have minds, that the laws of logic are valid, and we have to assume the basic reliability of human cognition. So in order to function in the world, these are, if we have to assume something in order to function in the world, she tells us, that means that it is part of general revelation. It's part of the created order.
Which everyone has access to.
Everyone has access to, exactly. In fact, she says that C.S. Lewis unmasks materialism. She says to practice the skill of detecting self-referential absurdity, that's this idea of the as we've been speaking about, worldviews committing suicide, right? When you apply them to themselves. She says, let's dissect a few more examples. Because materialism or naturalism is the unquestioned assumption in much of academia, let's begin with materialism, right? It claims that my thoughts are products of physical events, neurons firing in my brain, these physical events, that's all thoughts are, right? They're the product of these physical events. Materialism claims that these thoughts are like this. And so what does this mean, she asks us, right? It means, she says, that when I calculate that 5 plus 7 equals 12, or when I perceive a red rose, or when I judge that torturing people is evil, what is really happening is that my brain is doing physical things like producing chemical reactions and causing neurons to fire. That's what's really going on, says materialism, right? So these things then are just physical events that are happening in the world. In this case, in the location of my brain. So she says, a case in point, a recent book expounding materialism claims that ideas are physical states of matter within our brains. That's what ideas are, physical states of matter in our brains. Thus, the thought process is a series of brain states, right? It's various patterns of neurons that are firing in different ways, right? It's a series of physical configurations of matter, each causing the next in accordance with the deterministic laws that govern the interaction of physical objects, right? So like all the physical laws, it's just part of the physical laws. She says the problem is that digestion, for instance, is not something that can be true or false, right? In other words, if it's just physical things that are happening in our brain, right, it's akin to all the physical things that are happening in our body,
right?
Like digestion.
Yeah, breathing.
Right? Yeah, right? And of course, digestion is not something that can be true or false. It's just a biological fact.
Right. It's not saying, am I digesting food? It's saying digesting food is a physical process. So her torturing people is evil. Yep, that's just a thing.
A physical process that's going on in my brain. Oh, and that's all it is. That whole idea is all. That's all that idea is, right? Just like digestion is digestion. That's just it, right? It's something that can't be true or false, right? So if our thoughts are also biological facts determined by biological laws, then they're not the sort of thing that can be true or false.
Right. So you can never be wrong. Look at that. You're always right. Well, no, you can't always be right either.
Yeah, you can't be wrong or right.
You're just always.
Yeah. Now notice, she asks, but does this include our thoughts about materialism?
Right. So she's attempting to apply it to herself or to itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so when we do that, it undercuts its claim to truth. When the implications of materialism are applied to itself, she says it commits suicide, right? So if my thoughts are only neurons firing in my brain in certain patterns and that sort of thing, then my thoughts about materialism are the same thing. And therefore, how do I know that materialism exists, is true, or is anything?
Right. You couldn't even say that's true because it's not a truth statement. It's a brain state.
Exactly. It's a brain state. It's not a truth state. Yeah. Good. She says C.S. Lewis makes a similar argument in several of his writings. Here's an example, and she quotes him here. She says, if minds are wholly dependent on brains and brains on biochemistry and biochemistry in the long run on the meaningless flux of the atoms, I can understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than the sound of the wind in the trees. She says, Lewis then shows how this view defeats itself. Quote, but if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. He's unable to act.
That's right. So how do atheism or materialism avoid this self-refuting conclusion? Well, Lewis calls it a tacit exception, right? Everybody else except me, right, is right. I'm the only one that can see from the God's eye view, although for materialists, God doesn't exist.
Right, yeah.
So for their own theory, they have a tacit exception, right, at the moment anyway, that they're stating their claim. In building a case, they must implicitly trust that their own thinking is correct or true, right? They must exempt themselves from their own reductionistic categories of analysis. As one philosopher says, she mentions the materialist functions as though he were an angelic observer, somehow able to float above the deterministic cage in which he locks everyone else in, right? So in essence, materialism must tacitly assume a Christian epistemology, that is a Christian view of knowledge, how we know things, right? Or at least when they're arguing for their claims. Indeed, the sheer act of asserting materialism contradicts itself. How is that? How just the asserting that I'm a materialist?
Yeah.
How does that contradict itself? Well, she gives us several reasons. She says, if everything that exists is material, is that statement itself material? Or is it merely a series of sound waves? right? That's what they'd have to say, right? That statement is just a series of soundwaves. If I write out the statement, is it nothing but marks on a piece of paper? Of course not. The statement has linguistic meaning. It has logical properties. It has social function, right? Communicating with others, all of which transcend the material dimension. Right. And so, ironically, materialism cannot even be stated, she says, without refuting itself. Because humans are whole and integrated beings, we should expect our thoughts to be accompanied by physical events in the brain. Of course, that's true. Mm-hmm. But if we reduce thought processes to brain processes only, the result is a logical contradiction.
Right. So the reductionist tries to take this part and make it the whole, where it's just a part. Because and they themselves, even though they wouldn't want to say it because it undercuts their foundational belief, they too then believe that, because by asserting it, they are trying to convince you that materialism is the way to go. There's only material things. That's not material. What you just said, it's material in the sense, in one sense, that you're using your vocal cords to vibrate, the air. And your brain is having a neurological response. My ears are the
vibrations
all that is true. All that is physical. But what is the ultimate end for somebody saying?
But it's more than physical. You can't just reduce it down to physical. Right? It has meaning. It has properties other than physical. It has logical properties and communication functions and that sort of thing. And so, it's more than just physical. So you can't do that reductionism without being inconsistent, that is contradictory.
Yeah. Or you have some means by which to have it be this kind of mere narrative or something like that. And there you're getting into a different function that isn't.
You're the angelic observer.
So another theory that is usually produced is evolutionary epistemology. So again, epistemology is our theory of knowledge, how we know things, a naturalistic approach that applies evolution to the process of knowing. The theory proposes that the human mind is a product of natural selection. So you have a million different species from you, and at some point, there's I don't even know how to reduce the mind to something less mindless. So mind n-1, it would be, your ancestors, and then all of a sudden, poof, you have your mind state, I guess. So the human mind is this product of natural selection. We're selected for survival, but not for truth value. So again, this is kind of Dawkins' point, especially in the God delusion, is that that whatever is produced is by necessity a value for survival. Obviously, he doesn't apply this to religion. Currently, he wants to apply it to back then, whatever back then is. This evolutionary epistemology says that the human mind is a product of natural selection, so it's for survival.
So if it's a product of natural selection, then everything is geared toward survival. Right. That's the basic idea, the survival of the fittest kind of thing, right? And so everything is geared toward survival. And so minds were selected for, notice, even our minds were selected for their survival value, right? So that's all that they're there for. Right. And not what?
Not for truth. Right.
Not for truth.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I've used this example before, is that you're out mowing your lawn and you see the wind kind of shake the tall grass, and that's a snake out there. I better stay away. Well, okay, that's not true. It's just the wind going through it, but you reacted in such a way because your 20th degree ancestor survived because they thought that there was snakes in grass, rather than thinking there weren't snakes, because then they were able to survive. And so you have this through the lineage. You're always thinking there's snakes in the grass. So it may not be true, but it helps you to survive.
It's survival then. Right. Yeah.
So let's apply this then to itself. When we do that, when we say evolutionary epistemology is true, is that then a product of natural selection and a product for survival value and not a truth claim? Well, then, if so, it discredits its own truth. Evolutionary epistemology then commits suicide.
Because you can't say it's true. All you can say
it's good for survival.
It's good for survival.
Right.
Yeah, you can't say that it's true because, how do we know? How would we even know that?
Right.
Right.
And how do you check it? How do you evaluate two different competing theories? You'd have to say
every check would be a result of being selected for survival.
Right.
Of that.
Right. And it's only for you as that organism. It's not. You can't even really talk about a general species. We can't say all humans should have this survival aspect of evolutionary epistemology, because maybe for me, my survival is taking a different evolutionary approach, and so I shouldn't hold this. It would be not necessarily wrong, but would not be advantageous to my survival. Is what
right.
two competing theories would be.
In other words, if I drop the rock, I believe it's going to fall. Well, that may or may not be true. That belief is a result of survival value. I don't know whether or not that's true, right? All I know is it's good for me to have that belief in order so that I can survive.
Right?
And so all of my beliefs, all of my minds were selected for survival and not necessarily for truth. Now, they may be true.
Right.
But
coincidence.
we don't know that.
Right, by coincidence.
Yeah. And so survival value becomes king. And of course, then the theory of it itself, evolutionary epistemology, was selected for survival value. And so we can't know whether it's true. Right.
It's helpful to our survival somehow. I don't know how, but we'll know in the future. So Francis Crick, very famous, would go on to write, "Our highly developed brains, after all, were not evolved under the pressure of discovering scientific truth, but only to enable us to be clever enough to survive." But that means Crick's own theory is not a scientific truth, applies to itself. The theory commits suicide.
So sorry, Crick, your theory is only devised so that we're clever enough to survive.
Right.
It's not a truth.
Eric Brom says, sometimes you are more likely to survive and propagate if you believe a falsehood than if you believe the truth. And so actually trying to get other people to believe things that aren't that may be true but not advantageous to survival would be I don't know necessarily immoral, but it would be disadvantaged them to surviving.
Yeah.
So trying to communicate any new idea to anybody could potentially lead them to their ultimate death, and they're cutting off of their continuing the species. So we should stop all conversation.
Or, if even if it's false, if it contributes to survival value, it's a good thing, right?
Right. We can never know which ideas are true and which are adaptive but false. To make the dilemma even more puzzling, evolutionists tells us that natural selection has produced all sorts of false concepts in the human mind, and that's definitely true. All these false ideas were selected for their survival. So how can we know whether the theory of evolution itself is one of those false ideas? Again, the theory undercuts itself.
Is it true or is it adaptive but false?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know.
Right. And it's not just these lower level, snake in the grass, rock falls. It's everything. Everything. Yeah. This is an attempt to explain every truth claim, and that's this evolutionary epistemology. A few thinkers, to their credit, recognize the problem. Leon Westier writes, "If reason is a product of natural selection, then how much confidence can we have in rational argument for natural selection? Evolutionary biology cannot invoke the power of reason, even as it destroys it."
Oops.
Yeah. Thomas Nagel, who we talked about before, said, is the evolutionary hypothesis really compatible with the continued confidence in reason as a source of knowledge? His answer is no. I have to be able to believe that I follow the rules of logic because they are correct, not merely because I'm biologically programmed to do so. Hence, insofar as the evolutionary hypothesis itself depends on reason, it would be self-undermining. So we don't...
Well, even these folks, even Nagel, who is an atheist, recognizes the problem.
Right.
And acknowledges it.
He would want to be the first one to say, yep, this is the case. But he also wants to be correct and have an argument and believe true things and wants to believe the most amount of true things. And so he just doesn't want to survive. He wants to know truth. And this is the only way to do so.
So this next section is entitled Darwin's Selective Skepticism. She says that people are sometimes under the impression that Darwin himself recognized this problem, right? They typically cite Darwin's famous horrid doubt passage where he questions whether the human mind can be trustworthy if it's a product of evolution. Quote, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. But of course, Darwin's theory itself was a conviction of man's mind. So why should it be at all trustworthy? Surprisingly, Darwin never confronted this internal contradiction to his own theory. He was applying that to creationism, right? And so he never applied it to his own theory. Why not? Well, because she says that he expressed his horrid doubt selectively, only when considering the case for a creator. From time to time, Darwin admitted that he still found the idea of God persuasive. He once confessed in his inward conviction, quote, that the universe is not the result of chance. That was his inward conviction. It was in the next sentence that he expressed his horrid doubt. So the convictions he mistrust was his lingering conviction that the universe is not the result of chance. Right. That's what he rejected as a horrid doubt that he should mistrust, right? In another passage, he admits, I feel compelled to look at to a first cause having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of man. Again, however, he immediately veered off into skepticism. But then arises the doubt. Can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animal, be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? Right. But not about his theory, but about a creator. Yeah. Right. So he always applies it to creationism. He never applies it to his particular theory. Right.
So, and that's been restated many, many times by many different prominent theorists. People would say, okay, even if there is a God, he's so far above us that our monkey minds could not even possibly grasp what he could possibly give us to understand. Because we're so low, but we're never so low enough to even question whether or not we're, just this product of evolution or any of our larger truth claims like, what is my purpose in the world or things like that. It's always an appeal to say we can't even know very top things. But I mean, evolutionary theory is also a top claim, right? Anything that's not just mate, survive, eat, shelter, food, water, all that stuff. Anything above those things are high and lofty goals that we shouldn't even be concerned about because, that we can't even know, what justice is or what morality is. So we shouldn't even be asking those questions.
Yeah. She says, applied consistently, Darwinism undercuts not only itself, but also the entire scientific enterprise. Right? Keelan Malik, a writer trained in neurobiology, writes, if our cognitive capacities were simply evolved dispositions, there would be no way of knowing which of these capacities led to true beliefs and which to false ones. Thus, to view humans as little more than sophisticated animals undermines confidence in the scientific method itself, right? Because we cannot know. So science itself is at stake. John Lennox, professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford, writes that according to atheism, the mind that does science is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Now, if you knew that your computer was the product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it. So to me, atheism undermines the rationality I need to do science at all. So it undermines science and the ability to do science, right? And of course, atheism pursuing its research has no choice but to rely on rationality, just like everybody else does. But the point is that he has no philosophical basis for doing so, right? So notice, this is really a presuppositional argument, right? In other words, what do you have to have in order to do science? What has to be the case in order for rationality? What has to be the case in order for truth to exist? Those are what we might call transcendental questions that come out of presuppositionalism. And the atheist has to believe that he can rationally think, believe that, morality is true and that sort of thing. And he's borrowing from a different worldview because his worldview doesn't allow for those things. And so the presuppositionalists calls him on those things. Right. You can't do that, right? You're going further than what your worldview allows. You're cheating. Right?
Yeah. So the reason, especially in science too, there's you're driving down the road and you expect to get to the next rest stop before your ultimate destination. You get to the McDonald's, you get to the gas station, you get to the park to go for a walk, and ultimately to your end. If you were to say, there's no person in the driver's seat, it's just going. Well, you wouldn't even trust getting to the next mile marker, let alone to your ultimate end destination or any of those destinations to get to your end destination.
Well, Elon Musk might argue with you, right?
So, yeah, it's all product of the neural net. Yeah.
She says the reason so few atheists and materialists seem to recognize the problem is that, like Darwin, they apply their skepticism selectively to other theories and not their own, right? They apply it to undercut only the ideas that they reject, especially ideas about God. They make a tacit exception for their own worldview commitments, right? Them and not me. They work like this. Of course, I don't, right? I'm above that.
Yeah. I'm skeptical. Angelic perspective. Yeah. I'm skeptical, just not of me.
Yeah.
So it's clear now why Christianity played a significant role in launching the scientific revolution. Only a biblical worldview provides an adequate epistemology for science. First, a rational God created the world with an intelligible structure, and second, he created humans in his image. In the words of historian Richard Cohen, science required the concept of a rational creator of all things, along with the corollary that we lesser rational beings might, by virtue of that godlike rationality, be able to decipher the laws of nature. So it assumes order. It assumes the ability to know things. There are a lot of assumptions here that require,
in order to do science.
Yeah, in order to do science, and those are qualities that the Christian worldview allows you to have the basis for. Where the other one, you just have to, by force of will or by inconsistently. I mean, that's the big one. By inconsistently believing that. It undercuts your stated presumptions there.
Yeah.
For early science, the image of God was not a dry doctrine, which they gave merely cognitive asset, not merely something to put private faith in. They treated it as a public truth, the epistemological foundation for the entire scientific enterprise. Their goal, they said, was to think God's thoughts after him. And she has a lot of quotes in her. In the back of the book that add to that about early scientists. And that's still today. A widely quoted essay by Eugene Wigner is titled The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in Natural Science. Wigner asks why the mathematical formulas we devise in our head work so well in describing the external universe. The match between them is something bordering on the mysterious. Indeed, there is no rational explanation for it. No explanation that is within scientific materialism. Yeah, I mean, you come up with these mathematical problems, and what makes you think that anything in your evolved, stupid brain that is only there for survival should give you anything about the truth of, especially universal truth of the known universe. That shouldn't even be possible. Yeah. Boy. So definitely.
And even if it is possible, how would we ever know it?
Right. Yeah. And should you place enough confidence to put yourself on a big rocket booster and shoot you off into space with those math numbers? No, that's insane. Yeah. Should never do that.
But it mysteriously works.
It's weird. It's weird. Yeah. And to assume that you can do it more than once too. So, by contrast, the biblical view offers a perfectly reasonable explanation for the effectiveness of mathematics, namely, that a rational God created humans in His image to think His thoughts after Him, or at least have the ability to. In fact, looking at history, we find a biblically inspired confidence in the mathematic structure of the universe came first, before any actual scientific discoveries. Klein writes, early mathematicians were sure of the existence of mathematical laws underlying natural phenomena and persisted in search for them because they were convinced a priori that God had incorporated them in the structure, in the construction of the universe. So again, it assumes order. People go based on discovery. They kind of assume that they'll find something based on their kind of pre-drawn conclusions, and they go after and find that. That's why importance of understanding what theory is in science is so important. It's not just, well, let's just do a bunch of tests. You have this theory of what you think you're going to get as a result of observing phenomenon, and to say that this phenomenon is repeatable or observable or testable. Those are all things that you can't do in a materialistic universe. You can't hold it consistently. You can just assume it but you can't have any confidence in it. There's no justification for it. Okay, so we're going to break here before we destroy postmodernism, or let Professor Pearcey do it, and we'll be back next time. So this is episode 72. So 73 will be our next one. So thanks for joining us.
Yep. See you next time.